Right, so I am here today with Angelina Osborne, historian and author, and all Black history.
Yes, all Black British history, that's correct.
British history, okay, and we are having a conversation about Olive Morris. So would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Well, Olive Morris, she died quite young. She was 27 when she died.
So young.
That's right. And so for many years, the only people that really remembered Olive were the people that she campaigned with, the people who knew her as a person. And there was a building in Brixton Hill that was named after her. It was named after her in 1986, so a few years after she died. But most people, like myself, who grew up in Brixton, would go past that house, Olive Morris House. It's no longer there, it's been redeveloped. And you would sort of say, well, who was Olive Morris?
Exactly.
Why is her name on this building? And I subsequently, as I became interested in the history of Black Britain, I came to know who Olive Morris was, but still didn't know that much about her.
I mean, I found out about her a few years ago because I've always really liked Darkest Hour. And a lot of the information, when you're looking at the women that are around there and how dynamic she was for the little time that she was with us, to pass at 27 so kind of quickly and tragically, I say tragically, that it was cancer, wasn't it? Leukemia?
Yes, that's right.
But the legacy that she left, if she lasted another, even another 10 years, I cannot imagine what she could have achieved.
Yeah, I mean, she packed so much into the last 10 years of her life. I like to think about Olive Morris as kind of like a shooting comet, that she achieved so much and burned so brightly for such a short amount of time, but left such an incredible impact on all who knew her and on the history of Britain in a really important and crucial time around the 1970s. So I think it's really fitting and it's really, really gratifying to know that people now know more about her, know about her work and know about her activism, because she belongs firmly within the canon, within the historical canon and narrative of Black Britain.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. But there's a kind of we always hear about the men.
That's right, yeah.
And we never hear about the women. And,
don't.
Even when they did the series on the Mangrove just recently, she was still there was a small part.
Yeah.
When, she was such a big part of it all.
Yeah. She was an important part, but her part was more involved in other actual events. So we know that, for example, Althea Lecointe-Jones was part of the Mangrove Nine, and she was also the leader. People forget she was the leader of the Black Panthers, the Black British Panthers. So all of these women, not only her, Suzanne Scaife, Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey, and Olive Morris, and many others, Liz Obi, for example. These were women who were really, really fundamental and instrumental to the activism around Black women's experiences in the 1970s and 1980s. And certainly Dadsey and Scaife and Bryan, they wrote an amazing documentary history of women's involvement in the movement, which is called Heart of the Race. It's a great book, and I really recommend that people read this book because they talk so much about all the organizations that they were involved in, that Olive was involved in, like the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent, which is OAD, and the Black Women's Brixton Group. She was a co-founder.
I was about to say, didn't she found those? Yeah.
That's right, of both of those organizations. And Olive, it feels like in lots of ways that she came fully formed into the world, where she really, she just seemed to burst onto the scene. But I think that, if I may, I'd like to sort of give her a sort of biographical, some beginnings, a little bit of background to what what Olive was coming into, what she emerged into. So we know that she was born in 1952 in Jamaica, in the parish of St. Catherine's, and she came with her family at the age of 9 to live in Brixton. So that's around 1961 or 62. And to put that into further context, we have to think about, in this period, there's a whole load of things that are happening in terms of institutionally, socially, politically, and economically that people of African heritage were facing from the moment they sort of arrived in the UK en masse. We're talking about the next wave of migration from the 48 onwards. There was a concerted effort by these institutional structures to prevent people of African heritage from settling or making their lives as difficult as possible. And we sort of talked a lot about this sort of hostile environment that came out sort of like the early, sort of 2012 onwards, that the government was trying to make people who were here supposedly illegally. And I believe there is no such thing as an illegal immigrant. No human being is illegal. To encourage them to return home to their countries of origin. So in that moment, in that particular...
Straight after they asked us to come here.
Exactly. So, so this hostile environment, this is what she's coming into. So 61, 62, she's arrived, she's settled with her family. And 1962 was the actual Commonwealth Immigrants Act, where they were actually working to curb movement from the so-called Commonwealth, particularly the Caribbean, from people. They were making it much more difficult for them to enter the country. And then we know that 10 years later with the next 1971 Immigration Act, which made it even more difficult. So this, as I said, this institutional efforts to reduce immigration, to reduce people from coming in and settling, and that's the context that she's coming into. Not only is that, but we've got what's happening to young people, all people through education. People are being classed as, young students are being classed as educationally subnormal within the British school system. It's getting difficult to find jobs.
When we, I think maybe we need to just touch on that a little bit more, because we're thinking about the school systems, the schooling systems, how they were busing children out to different schools. And this was something that really kind of twigged my attention and only come through just recently, because I remember my mum telling me that she had to get a bus to school and she had to go to school miles away from the house. Never made a connection until just recently, when all of this stuff about education came out, that she was one of those kids that they decided that they had to send to special schools because she didn't talk the same, you know. Not that there was, because all my aunties and uncles went off to university, but they did it after school, because it was, you know, they did it in their later years, their 30s, their 40s or whatsoever. And it really does have a real impact on our community.
It had an impact on the community, had an impact on people individually about the feelings of shame and worthlessness that they would have felt, that they would have carried well into adulthood, that they're still dealing with today. So we know that there were policies, there was a political attitude that was determined to render people of African heritage, students of African heritage, as educationally subnormal, as less than, and as you said, for the simple fact that they spoke with an accent, a Caribbean accent, which they determined meant that they were not intelligent enough or unable to learn the so-called King's English or Queen's English at the time. So this had a devastating impact on people. And again, as a consequence of that, people began to campaign. They began to campaign against what was happening to their children at school. So it wasn't just activists, people who had committed to an activist lifestyle. It was parents.
So this would have been when the supplementary schools were coming out.
That's right.
Okay.
And so that's the tradition that she herself is coming into. So not only is there issues with employment, there's issues with housing. All these difficulties, as I said, these institutional and policy efforts to make life so difficult. I describe it as being under siege. People were literally under siege. They were being treated so poorly. You can't help but understand why people became radicalized.
Definitely. And just an overview of the supplementary schools. They were implemented by black parents.
That's right.
To be able to educate their children to a better standard that was happening within the schools.
That's right.
And they still survive today. There are still supplementary schools that are happening today, and there are people like Akala that really kind of hails those schools as something that was very important to his growth and the development of his knowledge to today.
That's correct. Supplementary schools was empowering, as Akala has really eloquently expressed in his own writings, how it empowered him to understand and be proud of himself, be proud of his heritage. And I've been working with a supplementary school for the past 20 years on and off, and what they do for the students is really immeasurable in terms of teaching them about their history, their heritage, as well as supplementing their English and their maths. But it's the important thing is about seeing themselves in the historical narrative, positive reinforcements about their history and their ancestors and themselves, which they weren't getting in mainstream schools.
Yeah. And Olive had a part in that.
She had a part in that. She started supplementary schools. Actually, she worked in when she went to study at the University of Manchester between 1975 and 78. Did a degree in social sciences.
And there's something about that I was reading, because we know that she did the degree, but it does say that she didn't have the exams to start off. So how did that kind of happen? Was there an evening school? What?
I'm not exactly sure, Tara. I think that I went to the archives, the Brixton archives, to look at her papers, and I had the privilege of looking at a lot of essays that she wrote, and she was so articulate. I hate that word. It doesn't help any. So let's clearly a bright, intelligent woman. But there was nothing in the records that said that she got her degree. I'm assuming she did, but I have no definite confirmation that she did. But we know that she attended university in those 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then from there, so because we reading about her, and like you say, that last 10 years, 17 to 27, is the time when most people are just finding their feet, just understanding what they want from life. And she was just doing these amazing things. Yeah.
She was. What was the formative event in her life was when she was 17 in 1969. She was at a record shop in Brixton with her friends listening to some records. A Nigerian diplomat comes in, buys some records, got a nice car, comes out, is immediately targeted by the police. Something around, there was an issue perhaps around his license plates, but it was part of the whole sus laws. So we know that the sus laws back in the late 60s and early 70s, up and throughout the 70s, was a law that police could use to arrest anybody on suspicion. And it was a law that was from the 19th century. So it was called the Suspicion and Vagrancy Act. And it meant that back then they could just arrest anybody who they felt looked dodgy. Yeah,
pretty similar to what we have now, the stop and search.
Exactly.
System.
So
There's no real different. They just changed the name a little bit.
Precisely. So they applied these sus laws to mainly young men of African heritage, and this is what happened to Clement Gomwalk. He was he was either arrested, but he was definitely being assaulted. He was being assaulted by the police. A crowd gathers and I don't know if this is true or not. She pushes through the crowd and she confronts the police, telling them to leave him alone. They then round on her, begin to attack her. They arrest her and they take her to the police station where she's beaten up. She's assaulted quite badly by the police, and then is released. So when I went to the
which really, back then was quite a regular thing.
Yes, that was totally regular. But she was a little, small, petite woman.
The stories of the police now, it's kind of made out like oh my God, this is. But really, this has been happening for a long time, and this is it's been normalised for such a long time within the police force that it's something they feel that they have the right to do and get away with. So it's now only because people are taking videos and people are taking pictures of it that things are being highlighted more. But I think being as a female, growing up in Highfields, we all knew that if you ever was unfortunate enough to be in the back of those Black Mariahs, you made sure you didn't end up on the floor.
Yeah.
So because you were going to get kicked and hit and punched and whatsoever. So it is quite prominent.
Yeah, a really sort of, as I said, a very terrifying time for a lot of young Black men and women, as you said, because if they knew they were, police, routinely would just arrest people because they felt like it, because they wanted to, because they acted with impunity, and as you said, they continue to act with impunity when it comes to members of the Black community. And but back then it was just rife in a way that they didn't have to explain. They didn't have to explain their actions. They weren't accountable to anybody. Today, they might be more accountable. As you said, we have mobile phones. We can document what's happening. It's still happening, but they're not. They have to somehow account for their behaviour. Back then, they didn't have to account for anything. So for Olive to get caught up in this being arrested and being assaulted, and actually threatened with sexual assault when she was in custody, and she was actually charged with convicted of assaulting a police officer.
And you just have to kind of, because she wasn't a tall woman, was she?
No, she was a petite woman. She
was a very petite woman. So thinking of a 17-year-old child being treated like that at the time. Yeah. And, that could have had such a detrimental effect on her. That could cause serious harm, to your mental health.
Oh, indeed.
But with her, it implemented a fight system.
Yeah, it empowered her. It made her decide somehow. Again, we're not privy to her thought processes, but some decision must have been made to say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to fight against injustice. So she joined many people who committed themselves towards racial and social justice. And so it was organising in that respect. So she got involved in the British Black Panthers. She was working with people like Darcus Howe, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Althea Jones LeCointe, and Farouk Dondi and others, Leela Hassan. To be involved and was very much involved in the Black Power movement. And, when people hear about the Black Power movement, the British Black Power movement in the 1970s, certainly they were inspired to an extent by the Black Panther Party in the United States. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't exactly the same. When we think of the term Black Power, and I'm sure it might be well applicable to what was happening in the United States, it was about self-determination. Black Power was about self-determination. It was about taking situation into your own hands, being the architect of your own destiny. Okay, not allowing yourself to be aims, not allowing the political and social and institutional structures to destroy you, to confront them. Yeah.
Why do you think? We all know about the Black Power movement in America, and a lot of people don't think it happened here. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it never got? I mean, even though it was there and it was really powerful, why is it kind of like, nobody knows to a certain extent?
That's a really good question. I would suggest that it hasn't become part of our historical narrative, and that is part of a wider issue around understanding the African and Caribbean presence historically. Okay, it's about sort of cherry picking which are the sort of palatable aspects of the narrative, and for many people, perhaps the Black Power movement was a very sort of frightening and disturbing aspect. When they were not frightening nor disturbing, they were thinking very seriously about the issues that people of African heritage were facing in that time. I don't want to use any bad language, but people were treated like animals. Let's say dirt, like worse than dirt. And if you're being treated worse than dirt, you're not going to put up with that. You're going to fight that
Do you think some of the, because when I'm thinking about it, I kind of think that in Britain there's a real way of, we're not racist. It's not that, we're not like the Americans. We're not, we're different, and that as a society, there's been this whitewashing, clear whitewashing of anything to do with enslavement, like it wasn't us, and the narrative and the history has been so well developed and created, because it is created. It's not true, but it's been easy for them to kind of go, well, it didn't happen here. We were always very good to black people here. And I wonder if that's the elements of why these stories and these narratives don't come out.
Well, let's sort of interrogate a little bit why that is, why it's easy for people to say that is not our narrative. So let's challenge that a little bit. Now, first of all, if we're talking about enslavement, the British started enslavement in the Americas, okay? From the 17th century onwards. So they brought, when they established the so-called American colonies, the British colonies, which is now America, they brought enslavement into it, right? They certainly the Spanish and the Portuguese first in the Caribbean, but then British wanted a piece of the action, right?
And
so they got in there.
They took a big piece of that action and they developed it very well.
So what creates that disconnect? What creates that disconnect is that everything happens off-site, right? So it's easy for you to sever that link. You can say everything, all the atrocities, all the violence did not happen necessarily on British soil. Again, some historians would argue against that. We could say, for example, as demonstrated, as indicated by the number of advertisements in the 17th and 18th century for runaway enslaved people in Britain would attest to and also challenge this sort of brutality and violence that was happening. So this thing that's happening off-site, so people out of sight, out of mind. Okay, so when does it become into the national consciousness? People are always conscious of what's happening in the Caribbean historically, but nobody's really talking about the violence. Yeah, they're not talking about what was really happening, not until the early 1780s. Okay, and then again, it is challenged by slave apologists. Okay, and this is where the knowledge, the sort of racist ideology comes into the fore, where the justification of enslavement is explained by these people are savages. We are creating a positive good. We are doing this for their own good. We're helping to civilize them. Okay, you can only explain and justify enslavement by reducing people to subhuman level. Okay, so this has been happening, and so because all the slave owners who were enriching themselves in the Caribbean and in the other parts of the Americas, they managed to change their narrative. They changed their story. So, we don't know anything about what they were actually getting up to. Okay, they become philanthropists. They start to give money to the poor. Yes. They start to build buildings that help.
Putting statues up of them.
We put statues up of them, and nobody knows or chooses to forget how they actually made their money. So this idea of, that's an American phenomenon, that's an American problem, is absolutely nonsense. I'll give another example. When we're talking about the First World War, for example, the reluctance for Caribbean soldiers to fight in the First World War. They did not want them to have arms. They didn't want them to be armed. They didn't want them to fight alongside white troops. This country is obsessed with racial hierarchies.
They call it cannon fodder.
Yes, cannon fodder. They did fight. They saw hand-to-hand combat, but they didn't want them to. So most of them...
But they put them at the front, so they were the
so they would die first.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So this idea of racial hierarchies has never gone away, okay? It exists to the present. So this is why we cannot have a sort of a constant historical narrative that encapsulates the good and the not so good, because Britain on the whole is obsessed with trying to keep the history of a great Britain. Okay, a Great Britain certainly in imperial terms, but not a Great Britain in terms of what they exported, the not so great things that they exported, such as racism, such as colonialism, such as violence, such as brutality.
You're kind of explaining my exhibition that we've got on. I'll have a quick plug there for the Pastel Painting exhibition, which is The Origins of Caste. And we've called some of the pseudo-scientists around at that time the not-so-great men of science. So you kind of, everything you just said is kind of accommodates that exhibition. But moving on back onto to Olive, kind of we know, what happened next?
So she's involved with the Black British Panthers. She's committed to Black Power. She's committed to Pan-Africanism as particular ideas and ideologies, Black nationalism. And as I said, that's about empowerment, self-empowerment. And then, so she's involved when they disband. She gets involved in OAD, which is the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Right, she gets involved in that. And what was OAD doing? They were really advocating for exploring the issues that women of colour, women of African heritage and women of Asian heritage were experiencing. Because back then there was this term sort of politically black, and that was an umbrella term to people who were all facing some levels of discrimination, racial discrimination. And so the experiences were common. They had that common experience of racial discrimination and inequality. And so OAD was the organisation that allowed them to explore the specific things that they were experiencing. And they actually they had a conference in 1979, early 1979 in Brixton, the Abeng Centre, which was the first conference for Black women. Okay. 300 women attended from across the whole country.
I've never heard of this. So.
Yes, I was doing some work earlier this year for the Black Cultural Archives, and they have all those papers. They have the conference notes, they have all the things they discussed, all the films they watched. It was an amazing, important gathering of black women to talk about the things that are facing them. It was early sort of March of 1979.
Okay.
So that alongside that, she founded the co-founders, as I said, the Brixton Black Women's Group. Okay, and she was also involved in the art of squatting. So breaking into empty homes and setting up and allowing people to have housing, because she saw housing as a human right. And people were struggling to find housing. They were struggling to pay for rent. And then that has parallels with today. I mean, we know that in most boroughs are thousands of empty houses, but they've really clamped down on squatting. It's much more difficult to do squatting. And she was like on the cover of like the Squatter's Handbook, like scaling roofs.
I think I've seen the picture. Yeah, like where she's kind of jumping over a roof.
Right, that's right. That's Olive doing that work. So she was really, as I said,
she seemed fearless.
She was fearless, and I feel like what was driving her was that she believed what she was doing was right. She believed what she was doing was really important. Okay, I think it was less about her as an individual, but more about these things are happening and we have to draw attention to them and we have to help people. So I feel that that's what was may have been one of the things that was driving her. And so she's involved in the squatters. She actually, if I may go back a bit as well, so she actually got arrested with Darcus Howe back in 1972.
Right.
In 1972, because there was a trial called the Oval 4 trial.
Yeah.
And the Oval 4 were 4 young black men who had been arrested at Oval Tube Station, accused of robbing people, mugging people, stealing women's handbags and what have you. Now, these 4 men were actually on their way, or either they were on their way or coming back from teaching at a supplementary school. They were radical black men. They had, like I said, it touched everyone. It's like you grew up in that time and you could not help but to become political. So these 4 young men were coming back from a supplementary school or going to teach at a supplementary school. They are arrested by a corrupt police officer. Okay, the corrupt police officer claims that they were stealing from people, and they actually went to court. They had a trial, and they were found guilty. And sentenced to 2 years. Subsequently, they were shortened to 8 months. But the conviction was totally false, but still stood for 47 years. I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago that it was actually rendered unsafe and quashed completely. Winston Trues and a couple of the other young men, and who a couple of them may have subsequently passed on, have spent their lives trying to clear their names. They subsequently found out, as I said, one of the police officers, maybe all of them, but definitely one of them, was so corrupt. He was, like I said, they acted with impunity. They could say whatever they wanted, could do whatever they want. But she was arrested outside. They claimed that she kicked an officer. Her and Darcus Howe got in a scuffle, and they also went to court, separate court date for assaulting a police officer, which eventually they were found not guilty because of the conflicting evidence that the police were giving around the event. So again, you know that sounds like another fit up as well. So this is what Olive. This is the milieu. This is the tradition that she was working out. So she was involved working with the Race Today collective. She was involved in there being a nationwide black political voice to highlight what was happening around the country, not just what was happening in London, of course, but what was happening all around the country. So Race Today, the collective, they were encouraging people to write in, to share all of their experiences of what they were having to deal with around the country. And that's the importance of that.
To take a little step back, mentioning about you were reading some of her reports and her essays and things like that. She did social science, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
So what was she writing about at that point?
She was really the ones that I read. She was kind of answering like questions that they had asked her to sort of write, essay questions around sort of socialism, essay questions around Marxist-Leninist theory. And she was writing very thoughtfully about those things, and you could tell that there's something she believed in very strongly. So she did identify as a Marxist-Leninist, and she did identify as a radical feminist as well. And these sort of ideas she was really trying to implement in her work. So certainly with OAD and the Brixton Black Women's Group and the Squatters Group. So she wasn't, we started at the beginning talking about we don't hear about the women's stories enough. We don't. So she's clearly saying we have experiences that are as important, they're different too, but as important as what the men were experiencing. And we cannot move forward unless both of those experiences are being addressed. It's not just about one or the other, it is both. If liberation is to happen, we all go in it together. It's not first past the line for one group and leaving the others behind.
So what was her parents like? Because you kind of have to wonder, like, where did this come from?
That's a good question. I have to confess, I know very little about her. I know she had siblings and she was very close to them. But I
met one of her brothers.
Did you?
Yeah, because he's actually, he's in a band with Sandra Cross.
Oh wow, I love Sandra Cross.
Yeah, and we
showing our age.
And there was an event that I was at, because we've done quite a bit with Sandra Cross over the years, and one of the guys, we were talking, I was saying what I do, and he said, no, Olive Morris is my sister. Wow. And I thought, I've got to grab him one time, and maybe I need to kind of pull him into a conversation.
I think it would be important to maybe talk to him, and because he would have a whole other side. He'd know her from a different viewpoint.
Maybe we tackle him together.
Yeah, I think that would be lovely. I would love that. But what I do know about is that she loved to dress up. She loved going out.
She liked to party.
So she wasn't all about about the cause. She was like a fully rounded person. She was a young woman, and she wanted to enjoy herself as well. So I feel like she enjoyed herself as much as she committed herself to her political activities. And I kind of feel that way. I mean, I read a wonderful biography of another wonderful woman, Claudia Jones, and Claudia Jones was, committed to the hilt. But she also liked to drink. She also liked to party. She also liked to dress in nice clothes. And it's like nice to get the idea of a woman who is committed to changing the world, but also is like, you know what, I like, you know, I'm not going to say I'm just going to be in a sackcloth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And to sort of like be doer and suffer for my
Which
cause.
is something like. And you know, I think it's a society thing. It's probably a male-dominated thing that they like to think. You know, if you look good or you party, and then you can't be doing something that's of importance.
Yeah.
You know, you must be this kind of Margaret Thatcher.
You know, just boring, not boring or not have any other dimensions to you. But you know, but you must have all these wonderful dimensions to you if you're going to want to involve yourself in something that really isn't for the faint-hearted. And we know that because she could have been killed. She faced danger. She faced danger. You said earlier she was fearless. You know, so you can't just be one thing. You've got to be kind of like a whole range of things.
So, but you know, now we know, you know, there's certain people that are very outspoken, and I suppose a lot of it is online and things like that. And they have the death threats, and they have the people. I mean, was that the same for her? Was that kind of thing happening at that time?
It's not clear that she received death threats, but I can't speculate. I can only speculate that she probably did have. You know, I would imagine there's a file on Olive Morris somewhere. There's a government file on her somewhere that I don't know if that is accessible. Probably maybe in the next 20 years, or because you know there's one on Claudia Jones that nobody's allowed to see. That's still sealed. So I imagine that anybody who was involved in Black Power politics, Black Power movement, British Black Panther organisation, had a government file, and they were watching them. So I feel that she was definitely certainly under surveillance. To what extent I can't say, but I imagine any time you stick your head over the parapet, you're going to get somebody who's going to want you to keep your mouth shut, to be quiet. So if she did experience that, it didn't stop her. So
to take that to more of a personal level, because you have been quite a trailblazer when we're talking about Black history and kind of fearless in the way that you're putting things together as well. Do you feel a backlash from the work that you do?
I've had a backlash when I first started doing this work. In the current climate, I think it's worse. It's worse. I personally haven't had anything particularly harmful said to me or done to me. But I know that people who speak up more than me, it's very kind of you to say that I'm a trailblazer. I've always been the person who's just doing like the burrowing away, doing the work, just quietly, just trying to get on with like pushing things forward. I've never really wanted to be somebody who's sort of in the spotlight, doing that. And I understand that comes with its own possible potential dangers. And that will come with when I start to put out more writings discussing. But I know that in this current climate, people are much more emboldened to tell you that you're wrong. They're much more emboldened to tell you better be quiet or else. And that should be taken it's very difficult because you want to keep yourself safe. And I must emphasize, I do not feel unsafe. I've not had the experiences that others have had. Like, for example, a friend of mine who spoke out against, I don't know if you know, in Wolverhampton, they have a Wolverhampton flag, and it's got chains on it. Okay, the chains represent the chains that were made in Wolverhampton, which we know they made the chains for enslavement. Right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, okay. Wolverhampton, the Black Country, what they're mostly famous for is their industry, their iron industry. Certainly in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were famous for their iron industry. And a lot of that iron was restraint, items of restraint, chains of restraint. That's what enriched that particular region. He spoke out and said, why do we have the Wolverhampton flag as chains? And he did receive death threats, and he had to walk with a bodyguard.
Wow.
Yeah, he had to have protection for a while. The response feels so disproportionate because you're pointing out something that people have a very strong emotional response to, because they have been taught that these are all good things.
And it is that thing where, you know, it seems it's okay to make racist comments, to say exactly what you feel, be you know, disregarding to black people and whatsoever. But as soon as people of black heritage come forward and say, actually, I feel that was racist, then you would think you've just raped one of their children. You know, it's a whole like, oh my God, I'm not racist. And then you get the fragility because the tears will come out and, you know, and then they become the victim.
Yeah, exactly. I think the reason for that is that people struggle to accept the realities of, they struggle to accept the realities of the history. They really struggle. They also struggle with the challenge to the history. Okay, they struggle also with us not knowing our place. We have a place, and if we step out of that place, then it's dangerous for us, and we get certainly the reactions that we get.
So these podcasts, although we pick particular icons that we wanted to talk about, but they're also about the guests that we have here. So tell us a bit about your journey.
Okay, so I came to working, learning and studying and disseminating Black history actually sort of like very, very late in my life, in that I became associated with Patrick Vernon, who's currently a campaigner around Windrush and particularly so-called Home Office. We call it a scandal, but I think we should call it an atrocity. So what's been happening with this particular atrocity and other campaigns that he's been involved in over the years. And it was with him that I started working on Black history and heritage through 100 Great Black Britons, which was a campaign that we started actually way back, 20 years ago in 2003. And so I became involved in writing and researching the history, the African and Caribbean presence through him. And it was actually then I got more interested in 18th century history and who were the men and sometimes women who were slave owners. Because I was just very frustrated by what had happened in 2007 around the bicentenary of the Act to Abolish the Trade and Trafficking in African People, where it was a real kind of celebration of the so-called humanitarian efforts of the British to end this accursed trade. And it's not as simple as that. If you're going to talk about that, you must talk about all of what that encapsulates, not just ending it, but why were your involvement in it? So there was less focus on the involvement and more focus on abolition. So I wanted to know about some of these men who were involved in, who were enriched, who were made very wealthy and powerful because of their involvement in enslaving people, in profiting from their labour.
So you followed the money.
Yeah, I wanted to follow the money because I know it's funny. Whenever I hear follow the money, I think about The Wire, and I think about The Wire because the great Lester Freeman said, "If you follow the drugs, all you'll find are drug dealers and addicts. But if you follow the money, you don't know where you'll end up." And when you follow the money, you don't, especially when it's related to transatlantic enslavement, you don't know where you'll end up. Okay, so case in point, most recently in the news, I think her name is Alexandra Sandbach. Her family made their fortune from the Sambach family in Guyana. Yeah, they were enslaving Africans in Guyana, and this is a historical fact. It is well documented. Okay, it's not about gotcha or pointing fingers. It is a fact. This is the research that's coming out right now, and she is trying to stop them from associating her, because she can do that, because she feels that she can mask or whitewash or downplay her family's involvement, which throughout the years trickles down to her, which allows her to attend very good schools, to live in
we had a similar thing,
right? But she doesn't want people to know about it.
So more about you. Because I kind of jumped in the middle there.
I don't know. I feel sort of embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed, but I just think I'm just. Yeah. So that's what I do.
So like you say, you came in at a later life. Mm-hmm. So what age were you?
I was in my early 30s.
And you see, this is another really interesting thing, because most of the people from the black community, they didn't go straight into education. Mm-hmm. There's always, not for everybody, I must say, but a majority, there's a break. Schooling wasn't that great. Mm-hmm. Maybe you didn't pick up the same things that you wanted to at school. And it was as, time you move through life and you feel, okay, actually, this is a big interest of mine. Yeah. And this is somewhere I want to take that. Was that the same for you?
Well, by this time I already had 2 degrees. I had my bachelor's and my master's degree. But in that period, the whole time of my sort of educational life up until that point, I never once had a teacher of African heritage. Never. I never learned anything about my history other than it was, on the whole, negative. Okay? That's how it was presented to me. And for a long time, I didn't question that. I just thought, okay. And then when I started to do this work, I realized they have really done us a huge, it's a crime, it's criminal what has happened, but I also understand that it's by design. It is a deliberate, intentional act for us to have forgotten not only our original languages, we don't, we speak English or we speak French or we speak the language of a colonizer. But also, if I didn't grow up in a Caribbean household, Jamaican household, I have my culture because that's how we lived. That's like, it was like, little Jamaica, because that's, that was what it was like when we were inside. That was our world, and outside we had to adapt to a world that was a white British world, and we had to learn how to assimilate and adapt to that reality. So this is, I've learned over time that this is a falsification has been taking place over the past 400 or 500 years. So once I became conscious of that, I wanted to learn everything. Of course, you cannot learn everything, but I wanted to learn as much as I could about that process.
So what was your first degrees on?
My first degree was in history in English literature. My second was also in history, cultural history. But again, I didn't learn anything about Black British history. This is in the late 90s. Nothing at all. And it was and even my PhD was focusing on the institution, the organization of the lobbyists, the 18th century lobbyists who wanted slavery to keep going. Yeah, and they organized, and the way they organized things for that to happen. Because of course they came from a particular class, a particular political class, and they were able to gain favor from different government departments, from the Prime Minister, and were able to influence the thinking around slavery, because a lot of them were also politicians themselves.
So do you think people like Olive, if that wasn't for those trailblazers in the first place, do you feel that you would still be taking the same path? I'm very much inspired by Olive Morris because I came across her while I was during my researches, and I am disappointed and angered that she's not part of our narrative. She should be what
school children every school child should know about Olive Morris. Every school child should know about this movement that took place not just in the capital, but all across the country in one manifestation or another.
Because those founding places that you're talking about, the organisations that she did those all over the country.
Yeah, she did it in Manchester, particularly. She went to and worked with people in Moss Side. So she didn't just keep it local. Although she's worked primarily out of where she was from, but when she moved to Manchester to study, she didn't just say, "I'm just going to be a student." I'm going to see what are the issues here. Are they similar or the same as what people are facing in London? And she found that they were similar and the same. Okay, and I imagine if she went to Bristol, she went to Leicester, she would have found some similarities. She would have found that people were all having these experiences that needed to be examined and addressed. Yeah, she knew that the issue around social justice and racial justice was not a London specific thing. It was wherever you found black communities in the UK. So I think that's why she's so important and why other activists are so important. These histories should be normalized in their application and introduction to our historical narratives within the curriculum.
Definitely.
And it's an absolute tragedy that there has been a consistent lobbying and activism, educational activism, that still cannot penetrate past the different departments of education for the past 30 years or more, that they cannot accept and understand the necessity for this to be implemented into schools.
Definitely. But we had, what was her name, Kimmy something or other, that said to implement Black history into schools would be treason, only just recently, which was just like, this is a black woman, this was coming for, but there is so many times that they use us to use ourselves against us. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, my whole term is there is no British history without Black history.
No.
There is no way you can separate. So why this isn't a bigger thing within schools? But it's that whitewashing again. Yeah. But if we are actually honest about the history of Britain, there is no way you can eradicate these stories, because this is a big part of our history as a collective, as British people.
Absolutely. It's political. The decision to include it or not include it is a political decision. Okay. That's why we continue to fight for this to be introduced. Certainly there are schemes of work, there are a curricula that does include, like Tony Warner's written a great book on migration, Justice to History have doing great work around helping teachers around the country to learn how to introduce these histories. But the work, it should be something that should be implemented in policy. But at the same time, I'm wary of that. I want it to happen, but I'm wary of who's going to be in control of it and how they intend to implement it. It's a tricky one. It's a very tricky one. There has to be a political will and commitment from whichever party, and we know it's not going to be this current government. Let's be clear. It's not going to be this government. You just said about Miss Badenoch saying it's treason, and that's what we've come to expect from her. We can't expect. She's not going to be the person who's going to want to be included because she, for whatever reason, she has this particular standpoint and belief that most people don't agree with, but it's politically expedient for her to do.
So, thinking about Olive, again, what would you say was her biggest achievement?
I think her biggest achievement was creating a feminist Black Power movement, a feminist Black Power ideology. That's her legacy. That's the biggest thing that Olive Morris left with us.
Okay.
So important. It's so important, and it's really gratifying to know that so many people want her to be remembered. I think she's on the face of the Brixton Black Pound. There's an organisation called the Remembering Olive Morris
I didn't even know there was a Brixton Buck Pound until I was kind of looking at this.
Yeah.
So if she was still here today, what do you think she'd be? Where do you think she'd be?
I think she would have been outside that hair shop in Peckham.
Oh God, yeah.
She would have been outside that hair shop in Peckham with a loudspeaker telling people to buy black. Not only that, but she would have been thinking very, very seriously about that. But she would have been campaigning. She would have been out there campaigning. She would not. She would. I think once you're an activist, you're always an activist.
Yeah. And I think my final question would be, why is there not more Olive Morrises out there now? Because we don't seem to have those kind of leaders. We don't have those big female voices or male voices at the moment that are kind of fighting for Black power and black experience. It seems to be there are a lot of people out here standing up and being part of a conversation, but there is no real leader.
Okay, I think one possible answer, Tara, is that it's the history. It's who are we inspired by? Okay, and often it is these historical figures, and we can say that Olive Morris is an important historical figure that not enough people know about. And if people knew about what Olive was doing, if more people, I should say, if more people understood what Olive did, if more people were introduced to her activities, her activities of the 1970s, that would inspire them. You know, if they knew how she did it, they don't have to do it how she did it, but they know that she did it. And it goes back to that. We are inspired by people of the past.
That's very true.
Yeah,
very
and
true.
she would be an amazing source and is an amazing source of inspiration. So the more we can get her story out there, then it may well inspire one young woman, one young girl to say, my God, that's what I'm going to do with my life.
So is there anything you'd like to add that you haven't said?
I just want to say that history is our clock, as John Henrik Clarke told us. It tells us where we are. It tells us what time of day we are in, or what's our season. Do not ignore history.
Definitely not. Perfect thing to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Tara Munroe and Angelina Osborne saying thank you for FlashBlack Part 3 on Olive Morris.